the story takes place in, the plot, like what is it that's happening, and character. And then basically it's like you're putting a character, you're putting a person in this environment, they're faced with this kind of plot, this situation, and what's that character gonna do, and what is that action gonna reveal, about their themselves. And are they gonna learn anything? Are they gonna change? Are they gonna stay the same? Are they gonna blow up a bridge, that kind of thing. So I thought that what I would do was kind of read short little snippets from some of the stories that I think kind of exemplify that idea of environment, plot, and character. And the first one that I'll share with you is from the story Fighting Words, which some of you wrote your letters about, which is the story of the family where, the mom doesn't want the daughter to speak Spanish with her grandparents. So here we go, Fighting Words. You are no longer allowed to speak Spanish. Ya, basta. Punto final. Olivia Saenz bitterly admonished her flustered 5-year-old daughter, Laura, who proceeded to pout and cry. It was 1955, and Olivia agreed with Mrs. Collins, the kindergarten teacher, that fluency should be forced to ensure Laura's assimilation into society. Otherwise, she'll never belong, Mrs. Collins alarmed Olivia. She'll never make it to college, never pass her high school classes. Mamá, pasa los frijoles, por favor, little Laura requested one night at the dinner table. Her mother snapped back in her thick Spanish accent. No, I'm not passing you the beans or any other food until you speak in English. The only kind of passing I'm interested in is you passing in school. Mamá, Laura whined, her thick black curls bobbing up and down around her small, round face, the color of milk chocolate. Pero Olivia, estás exagerando, ¿no? Interjected Luis, Laura's father, a bespectacled and trembling leaf of a man. He worked as an assistant manager at the Sears in downtown Phoenix. As he reached for the bowl to hand it to their daughter, Olivia slapped his wrist deftly away. No more Spanish. If she's going to learn and do better than we have, she's going to have to do good in her English. Laura wilted like the lettuce on a day-old chalupa. Mama, pass the beans, she mumbled reluctantly. Please, her mother nagged. Please, Laura surrendered. English was hard. It was new, and sometimes Laura's tongue got all twisted and tied up. So just a little segment from Fighting Words, which I think captures that frustration that the little girl faced, just in everyday life, and then later, as we see, kind of leads to her and her grandfather actually finding a way to forge an even more special relationship as they tried to overcome that obstacle that was being put in front of them. And what was interesting to me, what's interesting to me about that is that sometimes the obstacles end up being favors in a way, because that memory that she has of her grandfather becomes a very big deal. And then later at the end of the story, when she is trying to raise her own kids, she kind of brings it around full circle. And now she's trying to make sure that her kids, who are, now third generation or, American, she's trying to make sure that they learn Spanish, whereas before her mom was trying to make sure she learned English. So it's kind of bringing that full circle. To me, like that whole experience of being denied your language or your heritage is shocking, for me personally, because I grew up in a house where we spoke Spanish. I didn't speak any English till I was 5 years old, and I went to my first day at kindergarten, and then I just kind of learned, It just happened. I don't know. I guess kids make it happen, but it surprised me when I met other people who were Latinos, who sometimes either they didn't even know they were Latinos, or they basically had been denied that opportunity to even pick up any Spanish, or sometimes it was their parents. It had happened kind of in a generational process. So maybe their like this story was actually inspired by a story that came from my wife's grandmother, and like basically how her grandmother didn't let her kids speak Spanish at home. And when I heard that story, it was almost like traumatizing. I thought like, wow, I can't even imagine that. And then I, did some more reading and realized, hey, this was very common. It was very common in society at that time. So a little bit of a time travel to go back there in time and try to capture that slice of, one type of experience, one type of Latino experience. So that's about plot. I think trying to show in this story the plot device to you that was going on, that basically they had to create this. The plot was she couldn't speak Spanish, so how are you going to get around it? And she had to create this kind of code with her abuelito through mathematics to communicate without being caught. So that's a little bit about plot and an example of plot. Then I wanted to give an example of environment, the environment of the story. The environment's really important, because it sets the mood and it sets the tone. In the story, Bending the Laws of Motion, which was the story about little boy Ramon and really their relationship with his dad. But the environment was really important because it was set on the border, and I was really trying to capture some of the feelings I recalled about growing up on the border, which were that it was often very confusing place to be growing up because, we were growing up in two cultures at once, and what I think is really captured in the story is that it was kind of a chaotic environment, sometimes misleading because when you're trying to kind of adapt to the American culture, there's the allure of the American dream, which is often very tied to material success. And for Ramon, when he sees some of the other kids and like their parents, he thinks like that their material success is somehow, like a role model, if you will, like it represents what he wants. But then he ends up finding out that, those were the way that his friend's father had made his money was not legal. And so now, by the end of the story, he kind of, realizes that his dad, although his dad is a hardworking kind of, has a blue-collar job, has a dirty job, but sometimes he, struggles to make ends meet, but it's honest work, So he's trying to find that balance and that path between these values of honesty and hard work and the hard work ethic that his father's trying to teach him, and then the American dream and the pursuit of the American dream, and not being caught up in shortcuts to that dream. And really asking yourself, like, what matters more, But in terms of the environment, the border was kind of something I wanted to capture in the story, and this little segment, I think, does that a little bit. Let's see here. In my dad's beat-up pickup truck, on the way home, I rested my chin on the open window and gazed out at the passing houses as dusk fell. We lived in Southmost, a neighborhood of tiny wooden shacks crammed behind leaning chain-link fences, smashed between the railroad tracks and the river levee. It was the southernmost neighborhood in the United States. All I had to do was walk across the street and climb the grassy hill in order to see the Rio Grande and Mexico beyond. The following Sunday morning, my dad invited me to go with him to the mercado across the border to buy avocados, calabacitas, and chile peppers. For some reason, the ones at the H-E-B could never measure up to the ones sold across the border. The mercado bustled with activity, vendors hawking their goods loudly as crowds milled tightly amidst the dizzying array of stalls. Every fruit and vegetable imaginable could be found displayed in angled crates within the covered open-air marketplace. Scattered between the stalls were small counters where people could sit and order freshly made tortillas and tacos al pastor, as a smorgasbord of appetizing fragrances stimulated the senses. At the avocado stand, my father chatted with the vendor as if he'd known him since childhood. The wizened old man deftly split the avocados open with one fluid flick of his blade, removing the pit at the same time. He then inserted a single green chile serrano in the groove, clapped the two halves together, and placed them in a bag. Why does he take out the pit? I asked in fascination. Because it's against the law to take the avocados to el otro lado with the seeds still in them, he replied, counting out the colorful peso bills that shared his wallet with dull green dollars. El otro lado was what everyone on the Mexican side of the border called the United States. It literally meant the other side. Why? Well, because they're afraid that the seeds could carry diseases that might harm the crops in el otro lado, my dad explained. But they don't make you take the pits out of the peaches or the mangoes or the plums, I observed, and you couldn't take all the seeds out of the tomatoes or the chiles or the guayabas. My dad smiled as he paid the avocado man. You're right. I wonder why they pick on the avocados. Maybe they don't like guacamole. Who doesn't like guacamole? Come on. And why does he put the chile serrano in the middle where the pit was? I wondered out loud. It helps keep the avocado fresh and green until we eat it, my dad said, guiding me towards the chile stall. Speaking of chiles, here, I need to get some. My eyes swept across the vivid display of peppers, red, green, crimson, orange, yellow, brown. They came from all parts of Mexico and in all shapes, textures, and colors, long and gnarled, short and smooth, fresh, dried, smoked, pickled, big and small, round and oblong. As my dad picked out what he wanted, my eyes landed on my favorite treat from the mercado, the chile powder. It was a speckled orange and white blend of fine chile powder, salt, sugar, and crystallized lime, a taste bud tingling sensation with a spicy punch. It came in little plastic bags that were 1 inch wide and 5 inches long, all for 1 peso, 5 American cents in those days, and I loved it. So it's just kind of, a little memory there, but it's the environment that I think for me is kind of nostalgic now because I remember that experience, and in none of these stories do I really write like exactly the facts, but some of these experiences are very close to my heart, and I think that it's hard to write about an environment if you've never been in it. So that's why when I say writing about what you know is really helpful, is you can really capture the soul of it, and readers can sense that authenticity. And so that's the environment part that I wanted to share with you. And the last part, the last little piece I wanted to share with you is about character. And obviously, every story has a character, so all these 3 things exist in all the stories, in anything you might write, but certain aspects of it might be more important to some stories, and other aspects might be more important to others. In the story of Elia, and her flower bed and the wall, which is called It's My Wall Now, it's really about her. It's really about her inner struggle that she faces when this wall is put on her land as part of the border fence, and she has to kind of decide between her torn feelings about this, and this little segment is about that. The wall, for those of you who maybe haven't read it, the fence was built across an area that she's designed as a flower bed, and the flower bed is in the likeness of her son, who died serving the country at war. So it's kind of got some extra, I guess, emotional meaning to her. Why don't you just move the flower bed? Can you believe that? That's what my youngest son said. Elia's eyes loomed wide with disbelief as she gawked at her gaggle of friends across the table at the IHOP. To the young waiter, who had crossed illegally a few weeks earlier in a spot untouched by the border fence, they vaguely resembled a flock of seagulls chattering over each other. Mas café, the waiter asked, hoisting a pot of regular in his right hand and a pot of decaf in his left, a light sweat breaking out on his sun-beaten forehead. Sí, claro, the ladies chanted in unison, dismissing the slight man with synchronized waves of their hands. Well, Junior has a point, Mrs. Naylor replied haughtily, patting her chestnut-dyed beehive with her diamond-studded hands. Why not move the flower bed? Elia's 2 other friends, the spindly Mrs. Vela and the rotund Mrs. Vega, pursed their lips and braced themselves for their lifelong companion's response. But Elia contemplated the possibility quietly for a moment before replying. No, the idea was for me to design the flower bed in the likeness of my son David and place it where I could see it, out my window in the morning, and admire it from the porch. If I move it somewhere else, I won't be able to do that. And it's my land, isn't it? Why should I move it? Elia replied. Well, Mrs. Naylor retorted, knowing full well she was walking through a minefield, it would be a shame for your son to sacrifice his life for his country and then have your family's patriotism questioned because you spoke up against this border fence, wouldn't it? There, she'd said it, what they'd all been thinking since Elia had first started obsessing over this border fence a few weeks earlier. And she wasn't about to stop now. If you ask me, and I think you did, I say, don't go to that hearing and act like an ingrate. Move the flower bed and be done with it. Understand, they've built the border wall to protect us against the terrorists. You know that's the real problem. It's not the Mexicans. Everyone loves the Mexicans. Want some of my chocolate chip pancake, Elia? Piped up Mrs. Vega. I couldn't possibly eat another one, but they all knew that she could. You've been eating another one your whole life, Elia snapped bitterly. Mrs. Vega blushed and opened her mouth, but instead of responding, she decided to take one for the team, stuffing another piece of pancake into it to silence her resentment. Elia, please, Mrs. Vela soothed. No need to take it out on us. We're your friends. Well, what do you think? You two never say anything. Just our gringa friend here speaks up like it's her God-given right. What about you? Elia demanded. But they were out of practice, and Mrs. Naylor beat them to the punch. It is my God-given right, guaranteed by the Constitution. Thank you very much. Mrs. Vela raised her frail hand and almost shrank back into her seat when she felt all of their eyes fall on her. Her voice wavered as she ventured aloud. Well, actually, I do have an opinion. Out with it then, Mrs. Naylor exhorted, swigging coffee with such zeal, Elia suspected she might have spiked it with a dash of tequila. Pues, Elia has rights too. She is an American citizen. In fact, her family's been here on this land for a long time, longer than any of us. She looked pointedly for a fleeting moment at Mrs. Naylor, but dared not meet her eyes. That land was a Spanish grant from the king to your family generations ago, wasn't it, Elia? Elia nodded. My humble opinion, continued Mrs. Vela, is that Elia should speak up, or else we'll keep getting trampled by these people from Washington, D.C. They just don't understand our way of life here on the border. But we're American too, and we deserve a voice. We deserve to be heard. They all sat quietly for a moment. Mrs. Vela had been eating breakfast at this table every Wednesday morning for 15 years, and in all that time, she had probably not spoken as much as she had in the last 15 seconds. Clearing her throat and nodding respectfully toward Mrs. Vela, Elia added, I can't believe my patriotism would be questioned. It's not like I support the terrorists or even want more illegales crossing the river. I just want my land and my wishes respected. No one even asked me if they could build in my front yard. After all, I didn't cross the border crossed me. The land was in my family when this was a Spanish colony, then when it was Mexico, then when it became Texas, and finally when the United States took the land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande in the U.S.-Mexico War. And now the border's crossing me again, except it's leaving me in a no man's land between the river and this fence. What country am I in now? That's precisely the problem, Elia, Mrs. Naylor declared imperiously. People are going to think you don't want to be here. You didn't cross the border crossed you. Does that mean you'd rather this still be part of Mexico? Is that why you want the fence down, so we can be re-invaded? I'm telling you for your own good, just keep this to yourself. Don't go stirring up trouble. Think about your children and your grandchildren. Their future is here, not south of the border. Elia fought back the anger. She hadn't eaten chorizo con huevo for days in order to avoid the heartburn, but still, the acid kicked up and scorched her innards. She stared at her plate of uneaten pancakes drowning in syrup. She wanted to speak up. In fact, she wanted to yell at Rebecca Naylor that very instant for being so damn gringa. But she feared Rebecca was right. What if people saw her as a traitor for speaking up against the fence? What if instead of seeing her as the proud American mother of a fallen hero, they saw her as a treacherous outsider who belonged back in Mexico? What if they deported her in retaliation? The well-intentioned waiter reappeared with his swirling glass coffee pots. But before he could even open his mouth to ask, Mrs. Naylor cut him off sharply. Not now, Frank, she said, reading his name tag. For a moment, he looked confused. Then he smiled. Oh, yo no me llamo Frank, soy Julio. This is the, ¿cómo se dice, tag they had, he struggled in broken English. The ladies all assessed each other sourly. Any other Wednesday, they would have laughed, joked with him in Spanish, and left him a generous tip. Today was not that day. So I think for me, that story, it's interesting because the more the time passes since I wrote the stories, like the more I appreciate them in different ways. And that one to me is real special for the character aspect of it, of the fact that we all face these struggles in some way in our lives all the time, maybe about small things, maybe about bigger issues, things that we can affect in our daily lives, things that are maybe like so big in the national news that we think we can't affect. But we all question whether we should speak our mind or not, and how people are going to perceive us, when we speak our mind. And to me, I love that story because to me it symbolizes that there's nothing more immigrant than taking a risk for your dreams, because immigrants do risk their lives to come here for their dreams. And at the same time, there's nothing more American than speaking up for what you believe in to be right. And so I think if we can all do that and learn from Elia and from Mrs. Vela, to take a leap and have a little extra bravery and speak up, in the end, we're just contributing our voice to America. And that's part of our role and part of our rights. So I encourage you guys to do that. I encourage you to do that through writing if it's something that, strikes your fancy. And it doesn't have to be a whole book, although some of you may have a book in you. But before I wrote books, I wrote, columns in a newspaper. And you can write a letter to the editor. You can post something, a comment on a website, It's all right. And hopefully the people that I'm advocating for in this book, our immigrant, brothers and sisters will someday enjoy those rights as well. So thank you. With that, I'll turn it over to Berlin to see what questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudy, for sharing your insight behind the book. Let's do a short Q&A. So does anybody have a question that okay, I saw this hand up first. Question for Rudy. Mr. Jerry Wright.
Hello, my name is Jerry Wright, and it's a short question. It's a three-part question. And the first, okay, and it is, can you explain the meaning of the first and last statement in your book? That's the first question. The second one is, what is your definition of borders? And the third one and final question, were you always grammatically correct in your writing style?
Quotes he's referring to are the opening line about borders and then the end one as well.
Read them real quick. Thank you for the question. Appreciate it. It's not as simple as it sounds, but I will do my best. In the opening quote says, we love with our hearts, we think with our minds, but we are defined by our borders. And I guess what I was trying to get at in that with that quote was that I think that our borders as a country and kind of how we treat the people that cross those borders say a lot about who we are. We may have feelings for people, and we may have thoughts and ideas, but our actions, how we treat people, and in this case, immigrants, say a lot about who we are, define us as a country, define our nation. Because like they say, actions speak louder than words. The last quote, I'm going to look at that one. Oh, yeah, it's kind of a long one, but basically it's, the human quest for freedom and opportunity is a manifestation of our survival instinct. It is as natural as water's stubborn search for lower ground, or a vine's resilient creeping towards the sun. No man-made obstacle or law can stand in our way forever. In the end, we will persevere until we find our place of natural balance and harmony with the world in which we live. So what I was thinking about there was just that, kind of like Enrique in that first story where he had these dreams and ideas about building structures and, these grand schemes and everything, and he wanted to control people and the movement of people and nature and, things like the border, for instance. And I feel like in that quote, what I'm trying to get at is that nature has its own plans, and people have their own desires and needs that are like basically like human instinct. So things like migration, like immigrants coming in large numbers, or like when refugees are trying to get from one place in the world to another, as we've seen in Central America, where a lot of refugees have been trying to get to flee violence and come to America, as we're seeing the horrors in Syria, with all the refugees trying to get to Europe and trying to escape the violence. These are like things that you can build a fence, but people are going to find ways to crawl over it or dig under it, and we see it all the time. So I guess that's what I was getting at, was that, man is pretty arrogant sometimes to think that we can control all these things, and people are going to find their way to what they need. And that's more like the law of nature, I guess. How do I define borders? I mean, I think it's that's a real tough one, because it's one I hope to write some more books about. I love the border as the border can be seen as a division, but it's not only a division, it's a meeting place. It's a place where two very different worlds meet. And that doesn't always have to be a negative thing. In my experience growing up, it was a wonderful thing. It was a place where cultures come together and people come together, and it's a special harmony, it's a special place. So I think borders are meant to be crossed. It's like if you put a line in the sand, people are going to want to step over it. So it's an interesting construct, and for me, it's also like this great metaphor. Also, I like to explore a lot in my writing. I don't know how much I did in this book, but the border between life and death, and just how borders are kind of meant to be blurred in a way. Finally, grammatically correct, probably not, I do my best. I try. And I never had too much of a problem, but sometimes I like to take some poetic license and just try to write the way people would speak, be more conversational. But in general, I try to be grammatically correct with formal communications, because I think it's important. But then when you're writing something creative, you have that poetic license, and you can kind of have fun with it for emotional, kind of impact.
Okay, next question over here.
In the book, I noticed that every title had a meaning. I don't know if it's the meaning I would say. Every title, I could see it in the text. But bending the law of motion, I want to explain it to me so I can at least find.
Oh, good question.
And I would also like to ask, how long did it take you to finish this book?
Oh, thank you. Great questions. It took about a year, I'd say, of process of writing it. And I actually wrote it, most of the initial draft, like a long time ago. So it took me about a year to write that draft. Then it took me like another couple of years of editing and, working on it. And then it took me a couple of years where I was looking for an agent or a publisher to publish it, and so by the time that the book came out, it had been about 5 years after the time that I wrote the first draft, so it was a long process. But oftentimes I wanted to give up, and I just kind of kept coming back to it, I kept saying I can't give up. And I've heard from an author that I like. His name is Paolo Bacigalupi. He's a science fiction writer, and he says that he went to college and he was surrounded by a lot of writers, and that the only difference between him and those other writers, he's the only one that is successful. He's the only one that's gotten published of those writers, and he said the only thing different about him was not that he was a better writer, but that he was a sucker for punishment, and that he did not let the rejections stop him, because when you're writing, it just takes forever oftentimes, and you face a lot of rejections, and most people just kind of end up saying, forget it, so it's perseverance, that it takes time. The other question about bending the laws of motion, that's a good question. I'm trying to go back to remember why I gave it that title. because I originally thought about calling it like the International Chile Company, because it's about, you know, Ramon's, the story, and, you know, he starts a little Chile selling business, and he's in the import-export business, you know, importing powder from across the border. So it's kind of funny, you know, but the reason why I was thinking about how I looked at, well, he wants this bicycle, you know, and like the concluding scene is he's riding his bicycle and all that, and the laws of motion, you know, refer to the Isaac Newton's laws about when something is, you know, sitting still, it has the inertia, you know, and it's going to keep sitting still until, you know, a force acts upon it and makes it move. And then there's also the other law about for every action, like there's an equal and opposite reaction, you know. So if something is propelled forward, like usually something is pushing, you know, pushing it forward, or something's pushing in the opposite direction, you know, going in the opposite direction. So what I was thinking was, it was interesting to me that, like, that's what immigrants do. You know, immigrants are in a state of motion. Like, they don't stay inert in the country where they were. You know, they somehow, some reason, find that energy to move, and they cross that border, you know, and at the same time, many times they're bending the laws or breaking the laws. So there was a lot of little kind of subtle thoughts that led me to call it that, you know. But thanks for asking.
Okay, I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have for questions now. We're going to conclude our event, and I want to say thank you again to Rudy for coming. We will conclude our event. However, Rudy will be here available to sign your books, and you can meet him. And if you want to stick around, enjoy more refreshments, feel free to do so. So thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Rudy. And
thank you all. Thank you.